to record you. I'll record on this computer. Okay, we're recording.
Awesome. I'll admit everyone then. Good.
Perfect. I'll start in a minute. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll just get started in a minute or so as people filter in. Thanks for joining us. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm so excited today to welcome you to today's first opening session of the Promoting Food Security in Higher Education virtual conference. And today we're going to ask questions like, how do we make change in higher education? And start to answer that question by drawing on knowledge and experience from different areas of expertise. I'm your host today. My name's Sarah Kazicki, and I work at UBC as the Food Security Project Manager for our campus-wide food security initiative. And I'm also a member of our Promoting Food Security in Higher Education conference planning team. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you all today as an uninvited guest on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations in Vancouver. I look forward to discussing and reflecting further today and really throughout this conference in March on concepts of food justice and sovereignty, including Indigenous food sovereignty, recognizing that food insecurity is rooted in unjust systems of colonialism and racism. And I also look forward to taking action together on these complex intersectional issues, moving forward more just food secure communities. And I'd also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. Now, before we proceed further with the event, I just have a few housekeeping pieces for everyone. If you're experiencing any audio or video issues, please reach out via Zoom chat for assistance. Also, feel free to have your videos on or off, whatever you prefer. And that audience, you will all be muted so that the speakers can hear clearly. If you have any questions or any comments for our speakers, please put them in the chat box, as this will be monitored, and we will have some time at the end of the presentations for audience questions. Now, this event is also available in French if you prefer. And to switch your language to French, you can navigate to the bottom of the Zoom screen and you'll see a little world symbol for interpretation. And just click that symbol and it'll give you an option of English or French, and select French. And if you want to switch back to English, just again, click that same world symbol and select English. And just a note, if you don't want to switch to French, don't take any action and you'll be listening here in English. Now, this event is being recorded, and you can find the recording on the UBC Wellbeing YouTube channel, and a link will also be embedded on the event webpage that you registered at. And if you'd like to remove your name from Zoom, as this event will be published, you can click on the participants button at the top of your Zoom window, and you can hover over your mouse to your name in the participants list, and on the right side of that Zoom window, and you can click on rename. Choose any name you like. Okay, housekeeping done, all those bits and pieces. So I'd like to first start by providing you with a bit of an overview of how the conference really came to be and some of our intentions for this month's events and beyond. Now, the virtual conference, it came together through a collaboration between staff and faculty from the University of British Columbia, McMaster University, the University of Guelph, University of Ottawa, and Meal Exchange. And a question that we really asked as a group was, how do we support and learn from each other as we strive to understand and alleviate food insecurity on our campuses? And one way we hope is through this conference, which is an opportunity to bring people together from across Canada and beyond, I'm sure, to explore how we address complex intersectional issues such as food security. So this month, you'll have the opportunity to engage in learning sessions, networking with colleagues, participating in empathy mapping, as well as co-inform the development of principles to support institutional work. Now, a second way that we hope you can engage is in the development of a network or coalition of Canadian institutions that actively engage in knowledge exchange, research, and advocacy, for example. Now, how are we going to do this? That's really an excellent question that we're hoping to dive deeper into throughout this conference, including at our final session that's on March 31st. And that one is entitled, How Will We Make Change Together? And in preparation for that final event at the end of March, we want to hear how you'd like to engage and connect beyond this month. And to facilitate that, we'll be sending out a short survey through email in the coming weeks. So check that out in your inbox. So today, as we launch our month-long virtual conference, we're asking, how do we make change in higher education? And what can we learn from social innovation and social change movements, as they also seek to address complex intersectional problems? And in today's session, we'll first hear from our 5 panelists individually as they share their work and perspectives on social change, and then join together in conversation. And we will have the opportunity to ask our panelists a few audience questions, so please at any time submit your questions into the chat and we'll collate as many as we can. All right, let's kick it off. First, we're going to hear from Vicki Squires, an associate professor in educational administration from the University of Saskatchewan, who will be speaking to the Okanagan Charter as a guiding framework for settings-based and whole systems action. So Vicki, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen for a few slides that sort of set up the context of this, and just confirm the slideshow is showing now. Great. Okay, so part of my research is looking at enabling policy drivers that work on campuses to bring about change. And one thing I'm really passionate about is health promotion. So Dr. Chad London, who's the Dean of Kinesiology, and I are investigating the Okanagan Charter, the implementation of it across Canada. So just a sec. The charter really came about in 2015. There was an international conference on health promoting universities and colleges. It was held in Kelowna, BC, and they wanted to develop a charter that would have some commitments and calls to action that universities could understand and explore fairly easily and adapt to their own context. The charter development process engaged researchers, practitioners, administrators, students, policymakers, but there were 45 countries involved in this work. The first draft, they also had input from 225 people on a pre-conference survey. They had interviews, expert interviews, and existing charters to look at. And then they had a design lab. It was a really cool experience according to the participants in terms of having those negotiated conversations in time and space together. And they also had organizational leaders and representatives from many of the organizations that are tied into health promotion. The end result was an Okanagan Charter, a document that could be shared easily with campuses. It was quite a concise document. It puts its points forward very easily. Their commitments, there are 3 of them, and they are explanations of what every campus can consider when they would want to implement a charter on their campuses. They also have calls to action embedded in it. And these calls to action are really saying that the campuses need to embed a health promotion culture. And also we get back to what Sarah was talking about in terms of advocacy coalitions and working together locally as well as globally to institute these changes. The Canadian Health Promoting Campuses Network is the group that was developed nationally to link in people across the country who are invested in this work. And they use the charter in higher ed and health promotion internationally. They are also connected up with the international health promoting universities and colleges. They, interestingly, there are leaders that have been involved in this work for a long time, such as in the United Kingdom, but more emergent organizations such as the one in New Zealand. And now the NASPA and the American colleagues are looking at adopting the charter themselves as well, and working with the CHPCN in terms of how do we go about when you sign on to the charter. When campuses understand what the potential is here and reach out and say, hey, our campus is interested in signing up, members from that network will reach out and walk them through the process. Really, it's exploring what those commitments and calls to action were and engaging in conversations about how does this apply to our context. Then they come up with a plan of how they would address these commitments. Usually, the presidents of the universities and colleges are the signers onto the charter. And there's usually some champion who's also working heavily with the leadership on campus to engage in this work. This slide is the one that keeps changing. We kid ourselves about this because it almost weekly changes. There are now 29 campuses across Canada that are signed on, as well as 5 organizations. And just today, I discovered that Université Laval is the first French-speaking campus to sign on to the Okanagan Charter, so very exciting. As you can see, the spread across Canada as well. And interestingly, in terms of the work of health promotion, the provinces of Alberta and BC have been leading and supported by their government with resources to expand into this work. So Ontario is now engaged more heavily as well. The first campuses to sign on really indicate that most of them came from BC and Alberta. The second stage, the second wave, had more Ontario universities as well as the University of Saskatchewan. If you look at this, the outlier is really Memorial University that was in on this from the beginning and geographically different from the rest. Right now, those 29, I guess I have to add to this slide as well, of all the universities and colleges that have signed on to this point. And also the organizations, the signatory organizations that are part of this work. And as you can see, some of them are provincially situated and others are nationally organized. The study that Dr. London and I were engaged in was really to look at how do they implement and operationalize the commitments and calls to action in the charter. In my work in policy development, it really is apparent that it's easy to have fancy words and to sign agreements and policies and charters, but intents don't always match up with actions. And so how was this going on the first 10 signatory campuses, given that they should have been into the implementation stage by the time we began our work? I'm going to briefly just go over the last 2 slides about some of the findings and some of the challenges, because that's really not the intent of the rest of the session here today. But of the 10 campuses, I guess it's not a surprise to say that progress is extremely variable. In the places that it's going well, there is supportive leadership and engaged champions, and they will have a structure that supports this work across the campus. A lot of times the participants actually called it collaborative leadership, and the communication strategy was well aligned with that kind of structure. Most importantly is that the leaders of health promotion had a message that was visible and prominent in a lot of the work. They would repeat it often and in key documents such as strategic plans and vision statements. And even some of the presidents incorporated staying well within their convocation speeches and other public opportunities and venues to spread the message. They had dedicated resources, which is important. This work is not being done on the side of someone's desk. And the focus of most of the campuses was really on student well-being, although some of them are now moving more into the space of faculty and staff and employees as well as students, and making it a whole campus, whole system approach like it was intended to be. One thing that is very variable is having defined goals and milestones to guide the work. The evaluation piece that's so critical to policy development. How do you know where you are now? How do you determine when you get to your goal? How do you decide what are next steps? You need some metrics or some sort of sense of how things are going. So the evaluation stage is really not very well implemented at this stage. The challenges were almost the exact opposites of what we found as strengths. So if there weren't articulated goals, if they didn't have dedicated resources, if they focused on a siloed approach of looking at it as student services versus everything else, all of those dynamics meant that the work did not progress very fast. And really key is where there were changes in leadership or loss of champions on campus, so that somebody did not have that strong vision and kept connecting the work around campuses. So it's been very exciting work, and we're now looking at how do we move this out beyond the country and connect up with our international partners. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vicki, for your presentation. And I look forward to hearing a little bit more and digging deeper in our discussion with the rest of the panelists. Thanks so much. So next, we will welcome to the stage Adriana, Laurel, and Rachel Chang from the UBC Climate Hub, which is a student-led initiative to engage students and the campus community in change. Stage is yours.
Hello, so thank you so much for having us today, and thank you, Sarah, for that lovely introduction, and Vicki for that presentation. So I'll be going first. Rachel and I will be splitting our time in half, and I'll be talking about the Climate Hub first. So just a bit of an introduction to me. I'm a youth climate and racial justice activist. So my understanding of food security and food systems and food justice really stems from that activist lens. I'll be talking more about the Climate Hub, but I just did want to start with saying that from my perspective, food security and by extension, food justice and food sovereignty is a huge student and youth issue. And it's a concern that from my lens is deeply connected and tied to white supremacy, economic injustice, Indigenous sovereignty, as well as other systemic social justice issues. And my co-presenter, Rachel, will talk about this a little bit more during her portion of the presentation. I just wanted to kind of chat about the Climate Hub and our model, and how a model like the one we have can be actually used to work at an institutional level for other issues like food, for example. So the model of the Climate Hub has proven to be successful in mobilizing climate action and climate change at an institutional level. But like I said, this model can be used and the lessons from our experience can be used for other topics or for other sub-themes like food security, for example. And the Climate Hub now has institutional space. We have resources and time for student leadership and advocacy. As students, we demanded to have this space and we demanded to have these resources through our advocacy. And now that has led us to be in a position where we're able to continue this work with these resources and this time, which is really, really valuable. And the way that the Climate Hub operates, we have a bit of a hybrid model where usually in your usual department at UBC or in I can imagine other institutions is pretty similar. You have the staff, you have the faculty, and then students kind of follow the lead and are asked to do work on their behalf. But the Climate Hub has a bit of an inverted model where the staff are actually there to support student vision and student ideas. So we actually take the lead from students, and they are the ones who shape the direction of our work. So it's youth-led, student-led, and staff like myself are actually there to implement student visions, not the other way around. So I was one of the co-founders of the Climate Hub when I was a student. So way back, like 3 years now. I was part of the group that started the Climate Hub as a student, and now I've transitioned my role to be a staff member. So my position within the Climate Hub has really shifted because of that. Now as a staff member, I make sure that I am accountable to students, not the other way around. And the ideas we get come from students, and we also have part-time student staff like Rachel, who are really, really crucial to our vision and to helping shift our advocacy work and be really bold and ambitious. The role of the full-time staff is, again, to implement that student vision. And our core projects are designed with that student perspective in mind at its very core. We're also, the way that our model is designed is we're designed to be really flexible, to be able to adapt to new needs as issues come up. And the key pillars of our work really are justice, community and relationship building, and systemic change. That's something that's embedded within every single project, every event, everything we do. Those are the 3 pillars that we try to really accentuate. And we've got a couple of different things, a couple of different ways that we do this. So I won't take up too much time because I really want to hear from Rachel, but I'll just give a bit of an overview of some of the things that we're working on. So we have an annual showcase, which is a series of events that we organize that really aim to connect the intersectional nature of climate change. So connecting climate change to gender, connecting climate change to race, connecting climate change, you know, in the global south, or to mining companies, for example, just as a couple of examples of really trying to highlight this interconnected nature of the work that we're doing. We also have a climate justice research collaborative, which is an undergraduate research opportunity. The undergrad students get to shape their research, and we've also got a really cool partnership this year with the Downtown Eastside Indigenized Food Sovereignty Cooperative. So we have students who are supporting community organizations doing grassroots work on a variety of topics. Food justice is usually one that comes up. We've also got like the climate teachers connectors, where we have graduate students who do guest lectures in different faculties and departments on climate, which has actually showed to be really successful as well. And we've also got lots of other projects as well, like the Youth Climate Ambassador Program and the Climate Wellbeing Workshop and resources that I think Rachel is also taking the lead on. So I'll give her some space and time to talk about that if she likes. So like I said, although our focus really is on climate change, our model can be replicated and adapted to best fit the needs of other institutions and addressing different thematic gaps. So again, like we are working mostly on climate justice, but food, of course, comes into play when we talk about these things. And the model itself of student leadership and highlighting the voices of youth, especially BIPOC youth, especially marginalized youth, low-income youth, is crucial to really have a space for advocacy and action at an institutional level in academic institutions. So I'll pass it to Rachel.
Thanks, Adriana. And so when we were asked to kind of speak on a topic of food insecurity, we really wanted to use this space to address this issue from a lens of justice and equity. And so especially in Vancouver, university students are at a much greater risk of food insecurity because of high unemployment rates, rising tuition costs, and high rental prices. And the groups who are often disproportionately affected and most at risk of food insecurity on campus include international students, those who identify as transgender and non-binary, those with mental health conditions and with disabilities, as well as those primarily funded by student loans. And if we really pass it down, these groups often include Black, Indigenous, and racialized students identifying as food insecure as a result of enduring racialized income inequality. And at UBC as well, we need more comprehensive data on graduate students, faculty, and staff, people who really make up the entire community. And so we recognize food security not simply as an issue of food scarcity or lack of food literacy, as most people might believe it to be, but it's really tied to other determinants of health, including employment, income, housing, access to healthcare, and mental health support. It's really an issue of equity. And food security must ensure equitable access to healthy, nutritious, and culturally appropriate foods, which is often not the case for most students. And so while initiatives such as food banks and community kitchens are important short-term solutions to meet short-term needs, we really need to shift away from our dependence on individualistic and consumer-based solutions towards addressing social justice and environmental sustainability for the collective benefit. And this begins with recognizing that food insecurity is a systemic issue that requires structural income-based solutions. And so in higher education, this means reducing tuition fees, not proposing tuition hikes during a pandemic, alleviating student debt, income redistribution, as well as really strengthening and advocating for greater access to on-campus and provincial financial assistance and grants. As Vicky has alluded to, we need clear action plans and timelines to outline the allocation of staff, money, and resources to strengthen our strategic priorities, our hiring practices and commitments, and we need our universities to invest in us and our communities and not in extractive and harmful industries. But beyond that, we also need to recognize that we can't talk about food security without addressing food justice. We know that people's food needs are not being met globally. There are increasing rates of hunger, of poverty, of imbalances in the distribution of power and resources, and decision-making and democratic processes within the global food system are increasingly placed under the control of corporations and market forces, which distance people from the production and consumption of their own food. And so in its present state, our food system really poses significant challenges to social justice, ecological sustainability, community health, and democratic governance. And the reproduction of food injustices and food insecurity are inherently issues of equity, power, and justice. And to truly achieve food security in higher education and beyond, we need to be able to regain agency within the food system and be able to exercise our right to grow and consume fresh, nutritious, affordable, and culturally appropriate foods. And this also entails us thinking through the well-being of our agricultural workers, our migrant farm workers, our food service workers, and issues of food and Indigenous sovereignty, as Adriana has previously spoken to, and whether or not Indigenous communities can access their lands to gather, to hunt, to fish, and hold ceremony around traditional foods. And so food security cannot just be guaranteed for certain privileged groups of people. But more broadly for us at the Climate Hub, food security is also connected to climate change and justice. And this is because the impacts and risk of climate change are very similarly linked to the disproportionate impacts of food insecurity and food injustices, and affects the very same communities made vulnerable. And climate change as we know it will also continue to exacerbate stresses on the food systems and make us more food insecure in the face of an emergency or a natural disaster. Food and climate change is also directly tied to their access to land. For many Black and Indigenous communities, not having access to their own homelands or being displaced or forcibly removed from their lands impacts access to traditional foods, medicines, and practices. And so our solutions to both food insecurity and climate change must center the voices, the perspectives, traditional knowledges, and expertise of racialized, queer, disabled, working class communities, and most of all, prioritize land back. And so the work at the Hub is really to tackle these issues through equitable community-based solutions in order to bring about real solutions that tackle the root causes of all these intersecting issues that exist. We first need to recognize that food security is a symptom of much larger systemic issues, including settler colonialism, white supremacy, racism, classism, ableism, gender inequality, and so much more. And so to ultimately tackle food insecurity, we need a comprehensive approach that looks at income, decent work, access to equitable economic opportunities that will have broader social economic outcomes for students, including improved health and well-being, community safety, job and housing security, educational outcomes, and of course, food security. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel and Adriana, for sharing your perspective on the Climate Hub. And yeah, we'll have more time to chat about some of the points that you mentioned in our discussion section. So next, we're very excited to welcome Victoria Marchand. So she's the coordinator of the Mashkuwazi Wogamig Indigenous Resource Center at the University of Ottawa to share her work, including her work as a research assistant studying Indigenous food sovereignty. I will mention that Victoria did give me a bit of a heads up that she was managing a student emergency today and that she might be late. So it does look like, unless quickly, Victoria, you want to give a quick holler out, I believe that emergency has kept her from being here today. Okay. All right. So next, we're going to welcome Charles Levco. So Charles is the Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Food Systems and Associate Professor with the Department of Health Sciences at Lakehead University. And he's going to weave the tapestry of these thought-provoking presentations together into a food security framing and launch us into conversation. So over to you, Charles.
Thanks, Sarah. You can hear me okay? Good, okay. Great. It's unfortunate we're missing Victoria. I know she had some really important things to say. Maybe she'll join us and we can still have her say some words after. Well, first off, thanks to everyone for your presentations, to Vicky, Rachel, and Adriana. It's really inspiring to hear all this work. Hear about all this work. I think when we talk about food security, we often get stuck in a very kind of access lens. And I think what you've already done is you've already started to make some of those vital connections to issues of justice and sustainability, intersectionality, all these things that really are underlying the issues. So anyways, I just want to start actually by telling you, my name's Charles. I live in Thunder Bay. I work in Thunder Bay on the North Shore of Lake Superior. I am an uninvited guest on the traditional lands of Fort William First Nation, signatory to the Robinson-Superior Treaty of 1850. So a lot of my community-based scholarship really focuses on ways to build more equitable and sustainable food systems. I come at this with a justice lens. I work in a very collaborative way, always with people, with community, with other scholars. Also an intersectional lens, thinking about feminist approaches, thinking about issues of settler colonialism is a core part of my own work. And with that, I study things like, and I work with social movements, food justice, food sovereignty, with many wonderful students, researchers, administrators, and community activists, and I see a lot of them on the meeting today. So as Sarah mentioned, I've been kind of asked to say a few words about campus food security in relation to some of the things that speakers talked about. I want to try to be not too repetitive, but I do want to take some of what was said just a little bit further, because a lot of my focus is around food systems and food justice. But again, as I said, I really appreciate some of the connections that have already been made. That we can't think about issues of food security without thinking about some of these broader issues in respect to the impacts and also the solutions. So first off, I think when we talk about the term food security, there's a lot of different ways this is used, but I want to be really clear about what it is and why it exists. So according to the UN, United Nations, food security is defined often as a situation when people have physical access to social, economic, social and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their food preferences and dietary needs for an active and healthy life. So food insecurity is essentially when this doesn't happen, when we don't have that. So in Canada, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, the statistics are generally that about 4.4 million people, more than 1 in 8, suffer from food insecurity or in a food insecure situation, which includes well over 1.2 million children that live in food insecure households. Now, we also know that since COVID-19, these numbers have increased fairly dramatically. The latest I've read is about 1 in 7 people are facing food insecurity. And we know, and this was kind of said already by some of the speakers, that food insecurity is primarily the result of poverty and inequity. So we need to be clear that the definition of food insecurity is not about hunger, right? Hunger is the result, but it's really inadequate and insecure access to food due to financial constraints. So food insecurity is also closely related to other markers of social and economic inequity. So by the time most people aren't buying food, they're already facing all kinds of other challenges. So we see this primarily among households with low incomes, lone parent families, those people who rent their homes rather than own them, and of course students, which I'll also speak a bit about in a moment. we know that food insecurity is also getting worse with the COVID-19 pandemic, as I mentioned. So in May 2020, Statistics Canada polled Canadians about their level of food insecurity during the previous 30 days and found that almost 15% of people were food insecure, which is actually a 39% increase from the past year that we have data from. In Ontario, where I live, there was a food bank report. Hunger Ontario released a report recently and looked at the rise of food insecurity, or food bank use at least, around COVID-19. And they showed that between April and March of April 2019 and March 2020, food bank use had increased over 53% from the previous year. And with the onset of COVID-19, Ontario food banks also saw a huge surge in demand, with a 26% increase for the first-time visitors between March and June 2020. And as I'm sure many of you have seen, many other emergency food programs have reported a staggering increase, so a huge increase in use, with many organizations offering food charity for the first time ever, just to be able to meet emergency needs. And the other thing I need to say about these food bank statistics is they exceedingly underrepresent the problem of food insecurity. So we can, look at these numbers, how high they are, but the sample of these food bank recipients does not even come close to reflecting the populations that have been made vulnerable and are struggling with to put food on their tables. So some of the more shocking statistics that I've read say only about 20% of people who experience food insecurity actually use food banks. And something else that actually, Rachel, you were just talking about, which I think is really important, is when we talk about food insecurity, we have to acknowledge that the impacts are extremely uneven about who is actually food insecure. So people that are economically insecure, for example, are experiencing more significant impacts of food insecurity. Data has shown us, research has shown that this includes often a disproportionate numbers of refugees, newcomers, migrant workers, and especially Black, Indigenous people of color. Some of the more recent statistics I've been reading, especially around COVID-19, are that Black and Indigenous households are experiencing food insecurity nearly almost 3 times more. So they're 3 times more likely to be food insecure, and almost 50% of households in First Nation reserves are food insecure. And of course, that doesn't even speak to the hundreds of reserve, or the 100+ reserves that don't even have access to potable water to drink. So again, the COVID-19 pandemic has increased all of this, right? Especially among post-secondary students, many of whom, and Rachel, you also started talking about this, and Adriana as well. Students that have lost their jobs, lost access to on-campus food services, have increased stress and anxiety. But again, let's be clear that student food insecurity was already a significant problem well before COVID-19 made it even worse and unveiled some of this for some people for the first time. And this has really been driven by a number of factors that go well outside the control of individual students, from things like high tuition rates, especially for international students, restrictive and in many cases expensive on-campus food services, to the difficulty in finding work that actually offers a decent wage for students. So again, studies that I've been reading have shown that food insecurity rates, especially around COVID-19, actually pre-COVID-19 were about 30 to 40% of students facing food insecurity, but since COVID-19 have gone as high as 50%. And of course, again, which I've already mentioned and has been talked about, rates of food insecurity are generally highest among international students, as well as Black, Indigenous students of color. Which is reflective and in many cases driven by many of the racial inequalities and other inequalities that are present in broader society. So the experience of food insecurity, in short, really impacts students, not just their health and their stress levels, but also their grades and their graduation rates. So another reason why institutions need to take this very, very seriously. So ultimately, food security, I want to say the food system is not broken, right? I hear this a lot, like, oh, this is a broken food system. It's not serving the people it needs to. But I think it's important to say that I don't think that is the case. I think the food system is actually doing exactly what it was designed to do. And I think, Rachel, you talked about that a little bit, that these inequalities, these social injustices, the environmental injustices are actually built in to the way the food system works. And we're seeing it now. We've seen it for a long time, but we're seeing it more with COVID-19. I mean, the food system really concentrates wealth at the top and downloads the social and environmental costs onto people, students in many cases. And ultimately, this leads to a much less resilient food system and poses incredible risks to people, to our food supply, to our lands and watersheds. Again, Rachel, something you talked a bit about. So I just want to say a few words about solutions before, and then I'm looking forward to hearing more from the speakers and folks that are listening as well. And I think, again, as I've said, the presenters have really shared some really essential ways to think about solutions that lie kind of not in isolated approaches, and in many cases, not even in food, but in the social environmental relationships, right? The social movements, the networks that address many of these issues. So the Okanagan Charter, really thinking about issues of sustainability. I didn't know much about the Climate Hub, and I'm really impressed, and I would love to learn more about some of the real justice work you're doing. And I know Victoria's not here, but was going to talk about Indigenous food sovereignty, which is a hugely important area that I think anyone interested in, well, anything really needs to be focusing more on, and listening to some of the amazing Indigenous leaders and scholars that are doing such incredible work right now. But in thinking about solutions, I think it really needs to be said like clearly that volunteer-based, under-resourced emergency food charity does not have the capacity to address the growing problem. It's not working. It's not, and it's not the solution to the problem. I also want to say that, when people are in crisis, we do need solutions that can feed people, that can help people in the moment. So, while supporting people in times of crisis is, of course, the right thing to do, and we should be supporting these kinds of emergency, like campus food banks, for example, but they don't provide enough food for those in need. There's lots of research showing that. They are not serving those most food insecure, and they don't address any of the underlying issues of poverty, of equity, of justice that everyone's been talking about. I think campus food assistance is critical, but again, donated food, short-term responses, not addressing the longer-term problems of food insecurity, which I've been talking about and others have. Most campus is the challenge, right? Most campuses have a food bank. They're often student-run. They're often extremely under-resourced, and at best, they are a source of emergency relief. Under the COVID-19 pandemic, it's been, we've seen this more and more, and it is essential that they are supported. Universities, institutions need to be supporting these emergency response services. But again, this is only the starting place. It is not enough to just be supporting emergency services. If universities really want to address student food insecurity, right, they need to be a bigger part of addressing the underlying issues of inequity, that we've been talking about, and the major gap. So there's a lot of. One of the questions I wanted to ask folks was some of the examples they've seen that universities or institutions are working on. In our university, for example, here at Lakehead University, we've seen some new committees that have formed, where we're seeing students and faculty and administrators get together. Some universities I've been reading about have been establishing programs to raise or maintain incomes to offset costs, such as new emergency funds, reduction in tuitions for international students, or other kind of ways to support students who are in need. Other universities have established other cross-campus committees that have kind of brought people together to really think about some of the ways they can respond and issues they can address. There's been some really interesting federal government programs established to help people keep working, such as some of the wage subsidies, the Canada Emergency Student Benefit Program, delaying certain costs. But again, to effectively reduce food insecurity, we need ongoing policy interventions, not just one-time fundings. We need to address these things at a much more structural level. And especially for low-income households, for folks really kind of who have been very much vulnerabilized by the way society functions. So there's a lot of great examples. I won't go into any of them, but just to name a few, things like increased social assistance rates, basic income, living wages, universal health benefits, affordable housing, following through on some basic commitments to support Indigenous communities, self-determination and sovereignty are just a few examples. But again, I think, and just to finish, I want to say ultimately solutions really need to look to rebalance the rift between humans and nature. And Rachel, again, you talked a little bit about this, which I think is really important, to make connections between social justice and the environment, to address racism, white supremacy, patriarchy, settler colonialism within the food system and beyond that are really underlying this work. And it's unfortunate that Victoria couldn't be here because I was really looking forward to her talking a bit about Indigenous food sovereignty. And Rachel, part of what you ended with was, this idea of people need to be able to have more control, decision-making power over their food systems, which is really underlying this idea of food sovereignty. And I know she was going to talk a bit about that. But again, and I think just to finish, the last thing I want to say is I think this has to happen through collaboration, through collective mobilization, through social movements. Really, I mean, students have a lot of power, probably more power than in the university, to really impact things and make change, to find allies, and to work inside the system at times, to work with administration, work with faculty. But, as I say in all my classes, change does not come from the top down. It never has, and it never will. It has to come from the bottom up. And I think I'm always very inspired by hearing of some of the grassroots movements and folks organizing and looking to make change. So I will stop there. Oh, and I do have some, should I throw a question out, Sarah, Natasha, or do you want to move on to?
Do it. Go for it.
Okay,
I will just say that Victoria has joined. So
oh, she has. So maybe I'll just shut up and then Victoria can say some words.
Hi, Victoria. Is that okay? Not to put you on the spot. You just arrived. Oh, sorry, you're on mute. Our favorite Zoom saying.
Okay, great. It works now. Yeah, because I wasn't able to unmute myself. But yeah, I apologize. So I quite kakana Victoria Indigenous cause Kirikan CB Hashish Winaway Nidonjaba Mongoni Dodem. So my name is Victoria. I'm from Kirikan CB in Anishinaabe, which is an hour and a half north of Ottawa, and my mother's side, Winaway, which is 5 hours even further north from Kirikan CB. And I'm just excited to be here. So my full-time job is actually with the Indigenous Resource Center at the University of Ottawa. And that's actually what I was kind of caught up in doing. So I support the Indigenous students that are enrolled, prospecting students, and really focus on the retention aspect of them and seeing how it can support them academically, mentally, which is ironic because I'm a full-time student myself. So a lot of the things that I do in my job come from my own experience as a student. I've been in post-secondary for a while now. I might look young, but I've been in school for quite some time. Yeah, and I guess my relationship with food security or insecurity definitely stems from my Indigenous perspective. I know that everyone has kind of talked about their own perspectives, but I guess just utilizing the Indigenous perspective, it's difficult to really encompass something that is so cyclical, that is so connected to land and so connected to teachings. And it's very inherent. It's not, I always like to bring it to the conversation of spirituality, religion, and then indigeneity. It's not something that we chose. It's not something that we get to decide on. We are born with it. We are born with that inherent connection to land. We are born with that inherent and intrinsic connection to ourselves and our spirit and our community. And so really, I think of, when I think of food security or insecurity, I think of the land, I think of the animals, and I think of the spirits, and I think of ceremony and the teachings that really bring us together. And I'm an Anishinaabe. I'm really proud to be an Anishinaabe woman, or Anishinaabe Kwe. And I just wanted to kind of highlight that right now we have a grassroots movement based on food insecurity of the Moose Moratorium. So I would recommend everyone kind of take a moment after this panel or after this discussion to look up the Anishinaabe Moose Moratorium and how that has affected our community. And not only our community on reserve, but exterior to the reserve as well, especially university communities where we see those Indigenous students affected. We see the community members that attend post-secondary institutions affected by the grassroots movements due to food insecurity elsewhere. So food insecurity outside of the university, outside of institutions, are still systematically disadvantaging students inside a university. So it's a two-pronged way that we are disadvantaged or continually oppressed. But I don't want to, I'm not too sure where you're at, sorry, with the panel. So I'll just take a pause.
Thank you, Victoria. Yeah, no problem. We were just launching into a bit of a discussion. I think what you just shared is perfect to kind of float throughout the rest of our discussion if you've had the time that you need. And I see that a link has been posted to you about the Moose Moratorium. So thanks, Rachel, for that. Yeah, so let's launch into a discussion. We have a few, pre-formulated questions that we thought would be thought-provoking, but I haven't seen anything yet in the chat. So please type away, type your questions, and we'll look to collect them and be focusing on some audience questions towards the end of our session. So Charles, you were kind of mid in a question and I've got a question. Did you want to start with your question? Up to you.
Sure, I can, sure. I have a different question than you had because I know you're going to ask yours, but maybe I'll just start with mine. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is, and I talked a bit about this in respect to COVID-19, the pandemic, and some of the kind of existing realities that have been, unveiled or made visible through this whole, through the pandemic. And I do sometimes think that this is a moment. There is a moment here where there are conversations happening that haven't happened before. There's people paying attention to things. I just open any national newspaper or local newspaper, and there's discussion of like racial justice that has not been as present before. And I think there's a number of factors that's leading to that. But my question then is, if this is a moment, if there's a moment happening now, how do we ensure that we use this moment, maybe in the context of campus, food insecurity, to ensure that we don't end up going back to this kind of so-called normal, which was, already in many ways crisis proportion for many people? How do we make sure that we can use this moment to maybe move forward in a more equitable way, a direction that is more rooted in justice? And again, so how do we move forward ensuring we're not going back to a kind of normal that was already very problematic? That's my question.
Yeah, Vicky, I see your hand, your physical hand up.
Yeah, physical.
Yeah.
I think, I'm on a post-pandemic planning commission for my campus. And it's those kind of tables where you need to have somebody who brings that up as an issue and something that needs to be paid attention to going forward. Another kind of thing is looking at the community, having the campus have a champion who can bring in, engage the community, because there are supports out there broader than food banks. My work on campus, I'm also on a board called CHEP Good Food Inc. It started in terms of providing food to children in community schools in my home community. And then its mandate changed and shifted. So now we just call it CHEP Good Food Inc. And we provide good food boxes with healthy foods to seniors, residences, community schools, but also to campus. And so it's sold on campus for minimal amount of cost. And so especially the students and residents have access to good and healthy food, as opposed to, a box of pasta or something. Not that in an emergency, that's not good, but we need to find mechanisms within the community and connections with the campus to make sure that we are finding the experts in the community to help the campus. It's not just us that need to put all this forward, but you do need those champions, the work on the Okanagan Charter. If you don't have somebody at bending the ear of the king, for so to speak, bringing this to the attention of those people in decision-making capacities, you've lost an opportunity. So I really think the amplified voice that I'm hearing is not going to get lost as we move back to normal. I don't think we can go back to normal.
Yeah, Victoria, go ahead. And just jump in, panelists, if you're ready. So polite, everyone. Oh, I think you're still on mute, Victoria.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I do. Okay,
Great.
cool. I'm a co-host now. Thank you. Yeah, I think I had needed permission to unmute. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think obviously going back to Indigenous perspectives and just listening to Vicky kind of talk about like on campus, I think we need to situate ourselves in a place where we can decolonize food security as well. What does that look like? We're already trying to decolonize curriculum, education standards, everything like that. I do know that the province of BC are a little more advanced than the province of Ontario, where I am from, and definitely the province of Quebec. I don't want to compare and contrast too deeply, but a fact is a fact. But I think it's important for us to realize that for Indigenous communities, we are not with the province. We are not really, well, we're federal wards, we're under the federal jurisdiction, but it's important to know that we're from community, we're from land. So that's also acknowledging us living off the land. So when our Indigenous students are going to institutions, things can't go back to the way they are, because that would be creating more systemic barriers in place for their education. And not only are we looking at poverty for Indigenous students when they're leaving their community, we're looking at food insecurity as well. And they're not able to eat the moose meat that they want to eat. They're not able to eat the fish that they want to eat. They're not able to cook the same foods the same way. We're not able to do open fire or sand baked beans. We're not able to do any of those things really. And I'm talking about foods that I eat regularly because I get to drive to my community. I'm able to cook. I'm able to do all these things and bring it back to campus. I'm able to do that. When I was in university, I did that all the time. I was a member on the women's GG's soccer team, and I was able to use traditional meats to sustain my protein and work out. And that's a very privileged place. But so many people are in rural and remote communities, and they feel as though they are being pulled away from their family, being pulled away from their land, their traditional lands. That's like losing an arm almost. And they're forced to conform into an institution already that might not have the appropriate support services for them. And so imagine being a part of a new society that doesn't even understand the difference between First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, let alone the foods that they sustain themselves off of. And even to further that dialogue, we can't decolonize an inherent colonial system. So how are we supposed to be juggling all these things at once? It's a lot of heaviness for the student, and it's a lot of heaviness on the academy and the institutions that are supposed to provide these services. And like I can go on and on about this, but it definitely can't go back to the way it was. And that's why I think a way would to be creating these central pathways so that Indigenous people or Indigenous services within universities and colleges can create their own ways of securing food for their Indigenous students, or securing means to self-determine what they need in order to support their students, because a lot of times we're getting money from ministry, we're getting money from the province or from whoever, from grants, and we're just checking boxes off so that we can attain the funds, but we have so many barriers put around the money that we need to spend that it's not actually going to a lot of the students for what they need. They're going to what other people think they need. And that is just this violent cycle that we are continuously living in with the government as Indigenous people. They get to decide what we need. We don't get to self-determine that. And that it's just the same thing over and over again. And we just can't move forward that way.
Yeah, I can jump in and like add my attempts to answer this, but I feel like folks have given a really great response here. But from my perspective, I know that COVID-19 has been a really radicalizing moment for a lot of people, but I also do want to be really clear that for a lot of folks, we have been having these conversations for years already. So to me, it also begs the question of like, for people who are just realizing these things, like what took you so long? So that's one point that I think is really important, is that yes, these conversations are a lot more mainstream and that's so necessary, but there's also a lot of catching up to do with folks who've been organizing on this for decades. And I think like what to do now is to take this momentum and to actually use it so that we don't return to normal, so that we're able to actually capture the lessons and what we've learned over the last year. And I think like one important thing to me is we can't go back to like willingly ignoring these issues. Like we can't go back to the usual of being able to move forward with our plans without thinking about like how will this impact people, without thinking about how these issues are systemic. So I don't think we can allow ourselves to look away anymore. And to really think about shifting power structures. Like I think that we need to couple these different issues together to address it on a systemic level. Like, for example, I know within UBC, there's a really big priority right now to address anti-racism. But anti-racism is so deeply linked to climate change, and it's so deeply linked to food security, and it doesn't make sense to look at these in silos. It doesn't make sense to look at them in isolation. Like we have to address it together as a group and as a collective. So I think that's one really important thing on my end. And I think, for example, like this, I know this may seem quite intimidating, but students are ready for these changes. Like we have been ready. Like I keep saying we as if I'm still a student. I'm technically not a student. I've graduated for a year, but youth at least for sure are ready for these changes. And it's just time for institutions to catch up. And we really need to create these spaces and the resources for impacted people to make decisions and guide the work moving forward. I don't want to see any more top-down approaches to this. Like something that I know that I think Victoria said that really resonated with me is we know what we need. We know what solutions are like necessary for us. We don't need other folks to make assumptions about that. Like students know, youth know, but like, you know, we know what we need. So being able to have the space and the resources to address our needs being led by us is, I think, really important. And I do just want to make a quick point on mutual aid, because I think mutual aid has played a critical role in helping people survive and keep their heads afloat during COVID, but also before as well. Mutual aid operates outside of institutions and governments. So it is very much collective, it's very much grassroots. And mutual aid has been so crucial in COVID-19, like we've seen, and a lot of youth are actually leading these mutual aid projects as well. Like we've seen that at UBC, we've seen that in Vancouver. So just wanting to highlight that yes, institutions need to change, but there's also incredible movement happening at the grassroots level too. So yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, if I can just quickly chime in, I'm just like snapping away under my table, just agreeing with everything that Victoria and Adriana has been saying. But also just want to emphasize that we often see universities as these neutral institutions, but universities are very much political and are becoming increasingly corporatized. And because of that, universities are huge, powerful institutions that serve as levers of change. And so recognizing that there is huge resistance to change often by administration and governance, we need to keep pushing for clear action plans, for clear allocation of resources, for universities to put money where their mouth is. that. So for example, for UBC, I'm a divestment organizer. UBC has 25% of our endowment funds from land revenues. Well, how much of it is actually going back to Musqueam communities whose stolen lands we are located on versus going to extractive industries? I think we need to start really asking critical questions like that to not just, as Adriana alluded to, not just solve food insecurity, but really address other issues linked to housing, mental health supports, anti-Blackness and indigeneity within academia, and all these much broader issues.
Wow, great. Thank you all so much for that discussion. And I think just bringing it back to the role of higher education, I'm just wondering, should we be holding higher education to a higher standard relating to the health and well-being of its people compared to, say, you know, other organizations out there?
Well, if I'm being quite frank, the curriculum tells us to take care of ourselves, and they like, let's take nutrition for as an example. They say X, Y, Z, they put it on the platter for us, but then they don't develop the resources for students to take care of themselves appropriately. So I'm like, yes. Long, short answer.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that? Vicky, I'm curious your perspective.
I was thinking governments, provincial governments have to get involved in this. Education, K-12 and post-sec are under provincial jurisdiction. And it's made me quite concerned watching what's going on in Alberta right now with, you know, University of Alberta getting a $60 million cut overnight. Those kinds of things also impact us. So Rachel's right, there are university governance mechanisms that come into play that student groups need to understand, as well as faculty and staff. And how do you move change going through the levers of governance? The students I teach around admin and governance and post-sec, their final paper, one of them was talking about the inability of universities to change. And then he said, but wait a minute, this was March that they handed in the final paper. All of a sudden, we're all online, all over the place. So we can do it. We can make change when pushed hard enough. And so it's everybody that's involved. It's the board that's got control of the finances. It's finding the right people, services that are aligned, making the connections with the community. But also we have to start saying something about provincial governments cutting funds to education all over the place, every province across the world, asking us to find more revenue. And so where do you find more revenue? It's often in those places that Rachel was talking about, rather than sustainably figuring out commitments that will bring us revenue and help us support the needs of our campus community.
Charles, I'm kind of hoping you can jump in from your perspective as a faculty member and on the Senate. I recently learned.
it's a yeah. I'm not going to tell the story of how I got in the Senate, but yeah, I just want maybe just a few quick points. One is, I think, you know, we need to at one level recognize the how do I say this, not so beautiful history of universities in this country and more broadly. Like we're not talking about going back to a time when universities were, you know, all wonderful, because, you know, even, you know, at my university up to, you know, 2030, well, until the 60s, women weren't even allowed to be faculty here or come to the university, right? There's a time when universities were virtually, and many of them still are, almost all white men, right? And, you know, there's been a lot of improvement, but there's still a lot of, you know, there's still a real lack of Indigenous scholars, you know, Black scholars, people of color, women in the institutions. And I think we need to be clear about the universities. While, you know, there is a lot of wonderful potential, there are a lot of challenges, and those are a real systemic challenge. When we talk about systemic racism, you know, we can just look to a university to kind of understand what that looks like. And having said that, there's a lot of push right now for more equity in the university. And, I think we need to, as we've been talking about through this whole conversation, like support those efforts as, a first step. I think the other thing I was going to suggest is, and Vicky talked about this, is the funding models. Universities, if we look at the shift in funding over time, universities have become, especially, I speak to Ontario where, I live and work, there's really been a huge cutback of federal and provincial funding, which is leaving a lot of universities in a really tough place. I don't know if folks followed the Laurentian story, who just filed for bankruptcy, but there's a lot of details in that, but a lot of it comes down to a federal government funding model that has really pulled back. In Ontario, there was the provincial government announced that, we're going to cut tuition for all students, and everyone cheered, and then right off the backs of that, they took it away from universities, which means universities were stuck in terms of not being able to offer services like lots of services that, for the students. And it's a real challenge. And as a result, what we see is a lot of big universities replacing their public funding with private funding, which again creates a whole other dynamic in terms of who are universities responsible to and who do they answer to. Movements by students for free tuition, for example, to support, all kinds of more equity efforts are wonderful things that we need to be getting behind as a way to even, I think, as a way to talk about food insecurity on campuses and addressing these things. More access for Black, Indigenous students of color, which some universities are doing some great work around, but there's lots of room for improvement. And I guess just to end, I think and I said this already, but I'll just say it again. Universities are not going to change on their own. They will not. We need collaborations. We need collective organizing. Students, I think, again, I say it again, have a lot of power in a university. I mean, the whole university arguably is really set up for students. And I have seen students put forward proposals and arguments, and when you have a strong student group behind it, they can go a long way. And going back to what Vicky said, finding champions in the faculty, in your administration, in the community that are willing to support these things. If universities sometimes need to be shamed into work, that's one way to do it. But there are ways to work collectively. I mean, we have a food security committee that we formed at our university, and we sub-organize and we get together outside that committee and we talk about issues and we bring it to the committee and we talk about it. And that's a university approved committee, so we have access to the president if we want that. So anyways, the point is, I think, the students need to be kind of organizing around these things, and there's lots of faculty who are willing to support it, and we need to push universities to do better. That's all.
Thank you all for those points. I want to push a little bit further in terms of looking at some specific examples that higher education has shown leadership around an issue. Charles, you mentioned a few. I know at UBC, the Climate Hub, of course, is a great example. And I'm wondering if you can draw more into that and think about what we can look to inform our action, engage leadership, catalyze change around food insecurity. So looking at a few more specific and tangible examples, if you can share. And maybe Rachel and Adriana, just wondering some actual tangible, maybe even history and background in terms of the Climate Hub. Like, how did it come to be? How are you so, dare I say, powerful and influential within UBC? Like, how can we learn from that and translate that to food security work across the country?
Yeah. I guess I can jump in, so I can kind of share a little bit about the story of the hub and how we got to be. So 4 years now, 4 years ago, UBC was coming out with their strategic plan that was going to shape the priorities of the university and the institution for decades. And a bunch of student groups got together and student leaders who were interested in climate and environmental justice. And we got together and said, like, we need to find a way to make sure that climate justice is at the top of the agenda of the plan for the university for the next couple of decades. So we got together, and it was a group of maybe 15 students, 10 folks who showed up really regularly, 20 students who were kind of peripherally involved. And we started having meetings together as a collective and trying to advocate for this. So we went to our professors, we went to staff within our departments, we talked to other student groups. We tried to go all the way up to the top with you know, all the VPs and the presidents of the university. And it wasn't until we organized an event, which was a large town hall with over 400 people, where we were just like, UBC needs to actually engage and consult with the community before moving forward with these plans. If you're not going to do it, we're going to organize an event for you and show you the results. So we kind of did that, and they started paying attention after that. We showed them that this work was necessary and that there was interest. And after the town hall, folks really started to listen to us. And one of the things that came out of that town hall actually was the need to have a centralized place at UBC that focuses on climate justice and that brings those pieces together of systemic change, community and relationship building, and justice. Because there's a lot of folks doing climate work within their different departments and their faculties and their student clubs, but there wasn't a centralized place. So that's kind of how the idea of the hub came to be. And afterwards, we went to we repeated the cycle and went to pretty much every dean, every prof, every friend, every ally that we possibly could to say, look how many people support it. And we ended up receiving funding from the president's office to kind of as seed funding for this initiative. And we've been going ever since. And the more work we do, the more I feel like the more people realize that hubs are so necessary and networks and coalitions are so necessary to get this done, because you can't have one person doing things. It's important to have different champions all over connecting with each other to continue mobilizing and holding ourselves accountable. And I think the most important part of this is ambition. I think so many times we heard people say, no, that's not possible. No, that doesn't make sense. No, there's too many barriers. No, UBC is too bureaucratic. No, we don't have enough funding. No this, no that, no that. But our future depends on this work. And to a certain degree, we can't take no for an answer. We have to find ways to work around the institutional barriers that have been set up. And that can be replicated with any other theme. It can be done at any other institution as well. So that's what I'll say.
Okay, just opening it up again, you know, any promising examples that you can bring from your work, Charles, Victoria, Vicky, in terms of just informing action, engaging leadership, catalyzing change. We're really trying to harvest some best practices here.
I mean, for UOttawa, there's not many food security in my portfolio, at least, examples, but there is a lot that could relate to food security. I know there was a comment earlier about it linking to poverty, and I'm just trying to find the comment. Yeah, food insecurity is often a symptom of poverty and a lack of income. So essentially, for us, it would be anti-racism frameworks, anti-Indigenous racism. So I'm trying to think of, there was a movement recently at UOttawa called U Racism, and we've connected with Carleton and Algonquin as well, students in the Ottawa-Gatineau area, to really talk about racism in post-secondary institutions and how it really affects every single thing that we experience on or off campus as students. I think it was really interesting. I'm not too sure if other people heard about what happened at UOttawa, but there's a group of, I think, over 50 students stayed in the main central administration building called Taberry Hall, and they occupied the space for days, and they slept in the building, everything, and they demanded to meet with the administration to talk about a genuine, authentic conversation about the racism that they live in and the structural dependence that Brown people have to go through in order to attain certain privileges as they're non-Brown folk. So it's really interesting to kind of to tie that in with food security. As I think I mentioned it before in my first comment about Indigenous people living in post-secondary education and not being able to, like, just absolutely limited to the amount of food that we are able to access. And what is our role as a university to be able to support these people if we're under a provincial jurisdiction, you know, and it's, if the students are able to create change within the university, then the university will have to create change with the provinces and demand change. But if the universities aren't giving the space to the students, and the students are constantly having to fight for that, how exhausting and how slow is that process? You know, so that's why sometimes top-down approach really hurts the most vulnerable and really hurts the most marginalized, because the timeline should have happened 20 years ago. It should have happened whenever, right? But it didn't happen, and it's still not happening. And the conversations are only starting to take place. And that's the issue, is that people are only starting to learn, and only starting to learn that they have a responsibility to unlearn all of the colonial mechanisms that are embedded into us by the time from the second we're born. Even as an Anishinaabe person, I could be colonial too. So it's about, how do we unlearn all of these dynamics that we're forced into? Yeah, it's general, but racism would be a good example to look at for you, Ottawa.
I would say, going back to my work on the CHEP board and the connections with the community, one example would be that the pharmacy and nutrition students fairly obviously are connected to the work of CHEP, engage in research with the CHEP community, the CHEP organization. But we also started something, we were involved in setting up community gardens, but now we are involved in setting up the ASPE garden project as well, which is Indigenous foods and plants and traditional plants, and giving tours and information sessions on that, now virtually, I'm sure. And then we would hire Indigenous interns. Largely they came from the pharmacy and nutrition group to work in the gardens for the summer. Many of them have gone on to being directors of similar types of organizations in other communities. So it provides a good mechanism to discover your leadership capacity, and also contribute to understanding better what kinds of foods there are and what we're talking about when we're talking about Indigenous foods and food security.
Thank you all so much. Sorry, Charles. I see you've unmuted.
That's okay.
Go ahead.
So I was going to make a broad comment. There's others on the call. I see Barb Parker had her hand up. She could probably speak to this question much better than me, because she's been involved in a lot of this work at Lakehead. But I just wanted to make a broad comment, and one is just a few quick points. One is, Victoria, I really like the point you were making at the end around, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you were talking about like the learning, but also the unlearning that has to happen. I think universities are a really interesting place for that, where, you know, we have an opportunity to do that and to encourage that. And I don't know if you heard me say, I was saying before, I think before you got on, Victoria, just how there's been so many inspiring examples of Indigenous scholars, of Black scholars, you know, people of color who have really been like leaders in thinking around this and thinking about what that unlearning and relearning looks like. And, you know, I think that's in many ways, like, that's the real value. That's one of the main values of the university, is to really push that and push that hard. I've seen a lot of coalitions form. I've mentioned this a few times, coalitions of students that connect with faculty, connect with administration, and like really as a way to kind of push initiatives forward. And even it sounds like, Adriana, you were talking about the Climate Hub, is that's kind of how you did it. And, you know, I think like, again, more people together have so much more power. Student movements, I know Meal Exchange, who's a kind of sponsor of this call, has been excellent. They were up here at Lakehead and doing some work with us to think about like what this could look like. But I think, you know, also it's really important to look beyond campus. I mean, campus, there's a lot of opportunity, but a lot of this working, and Adriana, I really appreciate your comment you made before that, you know, these conversations have been happening. They're not new. They're not just about COVID, and they've been happening in many cases, you know, on and off campuses well, since the beginning. And, you know, working with groups, whether it's local groups, you know, like partnerships with like a good food box just to like bring food on campus, or something like in Thunder Bay here, we have an organization called the Indigenous Food Circle, and there's been a lot of students kind of doing work with that group, thinking about Indigenous food sovereignty in the region. But then there's national groups like Food Secure Canada, which I know a lot of folks here are connected to, or the Canadian Association of Food Studies, which is an academic association around food and food studies that are actively having these kind of conversations. And it's a great place. The conference, just maybe a plug, the Just Food Conference, or is that what it's called? It's Not Just Food, I think, conference, which is happening this year. It's going to be an excellent space. It's a coalition of groups: the Canadian Association for Food Studies, Agriculture and Human Values, Association for Food and Society, are all having a joint conference for the first time, I think, since 2008, maybe. But it's going to be all online, and it's a great place for students to come, to be learning, to be unlearning, to be organizing. There's going to be lots of great conversations on everything we've talked about. I think the focus of that conference is going to be on food justice. So yeah, so be like on campus, beyond campus. I'll put the link in there for the conference as well.
Perfect, thanks, Charles. Just seeing where we're at with time, I'm wondering, Climate Hub, Victoria, if you want to provide very brief, just a minute, your final thoughts, and then we'll move to a bit of a wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, before I forget, I was just going to say I'm also a research assistant with Dr. Vesh with the Institute of Indigenous Research and Studies. And right now we're building modules that focus on food security and food sovereignty. So it should be published shortly. So I'm helping with, it includes podcasts, a quiz bank, readings, everything. And it should be available to all post-secondary institutions across Canada. So feel free to connect with me whenever. I'll put my email in the chat. And if you wanted to follow up with those modules, I'd be happy to send them out when they're ready. Miigwech everyone for having me, and sorry I was late again.
No problem, Victoria, better late than never. So great to have you here. And thank you all so much for the engaging and inspiring discussion. And maybe just looking at the sake of time, I just wanted to share, I briefly alluded at the beginning of the session that we're working on forming a coalition and network, and a lot of the panelists alluded to that. And also we're looking to co-develop with all of you principles for addressing food security in higher education. And we have thankfully been supported for the Office of Nutrition, Policy and Promotion to work on those two projects. So we will be sending out a survey within the coming weeks to have your insight and have your contribution to shaping both of those things. Because as I mentioned at the beginning, we don't have too many assumptions in terms of needs for coalition and network, and we're really relying on this group, on this audience, to be helping to shape what that will look like. So we really appreciate you completing that short survey. And again, thanks so much for contributing to this work. So in close, and really on behalf of the entire conference planning team, and I'll speak maybe on behalf of the panelists as well too, I'd really like to thank you all for your engagement today in our kickoff session for the Promoting Food Security in Higher Education Conference. And a quick reminder, you can still register for more events. You can still share the conference with everyone in your network if you haven't already. And we have a recording of this event, and it's going to be posted on the UBC Wellbeing YouTube channel, which I believe Tash posted within the chat, and we'll also have it on the conference registration page. And we also have a really quick pop-up evaluation poll that'll come up on the screen, and we hope that you can quickly fill out those 2 questions and provide us with feedback on this event today. And again, we thank you so much for your energy and engagement and your work on your campuses, and we hope to see you at other events this month, including some of our networking. So again, thank you so much for your time.